The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read 42 degrees inside, while the mercury outside had dropped to -3. Torstein Bjørnstad stood near his stone fireplace, watching through a gun port as his neighbor stumbled through knee-deep snow toward the cabin, frost covering the man's beard, desperation in every movement. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival innovations like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story involves a technique that saved an entire settlement from starvation. The winter of 1842 arrived in Wyoming territory with unusual violence. Torstein Bjørnstad had survived 8 seasons in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries of the Green River, and he understood that mountain winters were harsh by nature. But the cold that settled over the high country in mid-November was different from anything he had experienced. The temperature dropped and stayed down. By early December, trappers throughout the region were struggling with conditions that made routine survival tasks nearly impossible. Torstein was Norwegian by birth, having emigrated from a small village near Bergen in 1834 at age 27. He had worked his way west gradually, learning the fur trade in Minnesota before pushing into the Rocky Mountain wilderness. His cabin sat in a narrow valley at roughly 7,000 feet elevation, positioned near a creek that provided water, and attracted the beaver he trapped for their pelts. The structure was solid by frontier standards. He had built it himself 3 years earlier using standard mountain construction. Logs notched at corners, chinked with moss and clay, a stone fireplace, 1 door, 2 small windows. It had served him adequately through previous winters. The first death came on December 8th. A trapper named William Sutherland was found in his cabin 4 miles downstream from Torstein's location. Sutherland had frozen despite having a full supply of firewood stacked inside his shelter. When other trappers found him, the fireplace was cold, but wood remained unused. The assumption was that Sutherland had let his fire die during the night and succumbed to cold before waking. It was a tragedy, but not unprecedented. Men died in the mountains regularly. The second death was different because it was impossible to explain away. Anders Lindgren had been Torstein's partner for 2 years. They maintained separate cabins, but trapped adjacent territories and helped each other with heavy work when needed. Anders was careful, experienced, and cautious about fire management. On the night of December 19th, Anders went to sleep with a fire burning strong in his fireplace. He never woke up. Torstein found him the next morning when Anders failed to appear for their planned meeting. The cabin door was frozen shut. Torstein had to chip ice from the frame before he could push it open. Inside, Anders lay in his sleeping furs, frozen solid. The fireplace still contained embers from the previous night's fire. Wood was stacked within arm's reach. Anders had not let his fire die accidentally. He had frozen to death 20 feet from a heat source that should have kept him alive. Torstein stood in that cabin for a long time, trying to understand what had happened. The interior temperature was perhaps 5 degrees, barely warmer than the outside air despite the enclosed space and residual heat from the fire. He examined the walls and immediately saw the problem. Wind was penetrating through every gap in the chinking. Cold air flowed through the cabin in steady streams. The fireplace heated the air directly in front of it, but that warm air was being pulled out through gaps and replaced constantly by frigid air flowing in. Anders had maintained his fire, but the cabin itself could not hold heat against the extreme cold and wind. Torstein buried Anders on a hillside above the creek 2 days later. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took him 6 hours to dig a grave using fire to soften the earth in stages. 17 men would die that winter in the Wyoming and Montana territories. Most froze in their cabins despite having firewood and knowing how to maintain fires. The cabins themselves were the problem. Torstein returned to his own cabin after burying Anders, and the structure looked different to him now. What had seemed adequate before now appeared dangerously inadequate. He began measuring temperature obsessively. He drove a nail into the wall near his fireplace and hung a mercury thermometer he had purchased in St. Louis 3 years earlier. Outside, he hung a second thermometer on the north wall where wind hit directly. The numbers told a grim story. With a fire burning constantly, consuming wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply by February, the interior temperature held at 15 degrees. Outside temperatures ranged from -5 to +10 degrees. His cabin was providing roughly 10 to 20 degrees of protection, and that protection was costing him enormous amounts of firewood. At this rate, he would run out of fuel before spring, and cutting wood in deep winter was brutally difficult and dangerous. He started noticing details he had ignored previously. Wind whistled through gaps in the chinking, despite his careful application of moss and clay. Cold air poured in around the doorframe. The window coverings, made from scraped deer hide, flexed and moved with every gust. Heat rose to the ceiling and seemed to disappear through the roof. The fireplace itself drew cold air from every crack and gap to feed its combustion, creating a circulation pattern that pulled warmth out of the cabin as fast as the fire produced it. Other trappers noticed Torstein's behavior changing. He stopped running his trap lines regularly. He spent hours standing outside his cabin, studying how wind moved around the structure. He borrowed tools and began making modifications that seemed pointless to observers. He rechinked his entire cabin using a new mixture that included pine resin and animal hair. He built a secondary door covering using thick planks. He stuffed dried grass into every gap he could find. Nothing worked. The interior temperature climbed to 18 degrees. He was still burning through firewood at an unsustainable rate, and he was still dangerously cold. A trapper named Michael Brennan stopped by in early January and found Torstein sitting outside in -10-degree weather, staring at the north wall of his cabin. Brennan asked if he was losing his mind to grief. Torstein explained that he was trying to understand why a snowdrift against the wall kept that section warmer than the rest of the cabin. Brennan shook his head and left. But Torstein had noticed something important. Where wind-driven snow had piled against his cabin wall, creating a drift 4 feet high and 6 feet long, the interior wall in that section felt noticeably warmer to the touch. The snow was acting as insulation, blocking wind, and creating a barrier between the extreme cold and the cabin logs. The observation seemed simple, almost obvious, but it suggested a possibility that went against everything Torstein understood about construction. If snow could insulate, could ice work even better? The idea seemed insane. Ice was cold. Ice was the enemy. But ice was also solid, uniform, and available in unlimited quantities from the frozen creek. Torstein stood up from where he had been sitting and walked toward the water. The obsession was taking a new direction. Torstein's childhood in Norway had prepared him for this idea in ways he had not recognized until now. His grandfather had been a fisherman who maintained ice fishing shelters on frozen lakes during winter months. The old man had taught Torstein that packed snow around a small shelter could make the interior warm enough that men removed their coats despite sitting on frozen water. The principle was simple. Still air trapped in snow created insulation that blocked wind and slowed heat loss. Ice was different from snow, but the principle might be similar. Ice would block wind completely. Ice could be cut into uniform blocks and stacked like stones. Ice was available in massive quantities from the creek, which had frozen to a depth of 18 inches by mid-January. The question was whether ice blocks could be used in a way that insulated rather than conducted cold directly into the cabin. Torstein spent 3 days cutting test blocks from the creek ice. The work was brutal. He used a long cross-cut saw to score lines in the ice, then drove iron wedges to split blocks free. The first blocks were irregular and awkward, ranging from small fragments to pieces too heavy to lift. He refined his technique gradually, learning to read the ice for natural crack lines and stress points. By the 4th day, he had developed a system. He scored a grid pattern into the ice surface using measurements he had marked on a wooden stick. Each rectangle measured 18 inches by 12 inches. He cut vertical lines first, sawing down through the full 18-inch thickness of ice. Then he cut horizontal lines, creating blocks that could be pried free with an iron bar. Each block weighed approximately 45 pounds and could be carried awkwardly by one man or moved more easily by two. The blocks were remarkably uniform. Ice froze in consistent layers, and cutting from a single area of the creek produced blocks of nearly identical size and clarity. Torstein stacked test blocks near his cabin, experimenting with different arrangements. He quickly discovered that ice stacked well, the blocks adhering slightly to each other and creating stable walls even without mortar. But the fundamental problem remained. If he stacked ice blocks directly against his cabin wall, the ice would conduct cold into the logs. He would be building a refrigerator, not insulation. He sat beside his test wall one evening, frustrated, when the solution appeared obvious. He did not need the ice touching the cabin. He needed the ice separated from the cabin by a gap. Air trapped between ice and wood would insulate. The ice would serve as a wind barrier and outer shell. The air gap would prevent cold conduction. The cabin wall would hold interior heat. The concept was simple, but would require careful construction. He needed a way to maintain a consistent gap between ice wall and cabin wall. Wooden spacers would work, small diameter logs placed vertically to hold the ice wall at a fixed distance. Torstein pulled out a piece of charcoal and began sketching designs on a flat board, calculating dimensions and materials needed. Other trappers would think he was insane, but the physics made sense. The idea was sound in theory, but theory meant nothing in the mountains. Torstein needed to solve specific engineering problems before he could build anything useful. The primary challenge was maintaining a consistent air gap between the ice wall and his cabin's log wall. If the gap varied, if ice blocks touched logs at any point, those contact points would conduct cold directly into the structure and negate the insulation effect. He started with calculations based on observation. His cabin wall was roughly 8 inches thick, consisting of logs with their bark removed. The ice blocks he was cutting measured 18 inches long, 12 inches tall, and 8 inches thick. If he built the ice wall parallel to his cabin wall, he needed spacers to maintain separation. The question was how wide that gap should be. Too narrow, and the air would not insulate effectively. Too wide, and convection currents might move cold air against the cabin wall. Torstein had no formal education in physics, but he understood practical principles from years of living in extreme conditions. Dead air insulated. Moving air transferred heat. The gap needed to be wide enough for air to remain still. He experimented with different widths using scrap wood and his thermometer. He built a small test section against the south wall of his cabin, creating gaps of 4 inches, 8 inches, and 12 inches. He monitored temperature differences over 3 days. The 8-inch gap performed best, showing interior wall temperatures 5 degrees warmer than the 4-inch gap and 3 degrees warmer than the 12-inch gap. With the gap width determined, Torstein designed his spacer system. He needed vertical supports that would hold the ice wall exactly 8 inches away from the cabin wall while bearing the weight of stacked ice blocks. Small diameter pine logs worked well. He selected poles approximately 3 inches in diameter, stripped of bark, cut to heights matching his cabin wall. These poles would stand vertically between the ice wall and cabin wall, one pole every 3 feet along the wall length. The poles themselves created a potential problem. Wood conducts cold better than still air. If the poles connected the ice wall directly to the cabin wall, they would serve as thermal bridges, transferring cold across the gap. Torstein's solution was simple but effective. He did not extend the poles fully across the gap. Instead, he cut them to 6-inch lengths, attaching them to the cabin wall and allowing them to project outward. The ice wall would rest against these short projections, but 2 inches of air gap would remain between the pole ends and the ice, breaking the conductive path. Between the ice blocks themselves, Torstein planned to insert thin wooden dividers. These dividers would prevent blocks from shifting while also creating vertical channels that might allow moisture to drain downward. The dividers would be bark-covered slabs, roughly 1 inch thick, providing minimal thermal bridging while adding structural stability. The design was complete. He needed approximately 200 ice blocks for the north wall of his cabin, the wall that faced prevailing winds. He needed 30 spacer poles and 60 dividers. The construction would take weeks, but the mathematics suggested it would work. Torstein began cutting ice in earnest. Construction began on January 23, 1843. The temperature that morning was -8 degrees with clear skies and minimal wind. Torstein had spent the previous week cutting and stockpiling ice blocks on the creek. 212 blocks sat stacked near the water, covered with pine boughs to protect them from direct sunlight. Each morning before dawn, he hauled blocks from the creek to his cabin using a hand-built sledge that could carry 6 blocks per trip. The foundation was critical. Ice blocks could not sit directly on snow, which would compress and shift under weight. Torstein cleared snow from a strip along his cabin's north wall, exposing frozen ground. He packed this area with additional snow, then poured water over it each evening, allowing it to freeze overnight in successive layers. After 4 days, he had created a level ice platform 6 inches thick that extended 3 feet out from the cabin wall. The spacer poles went up first. He had cut 30 poles, each 6 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. Using an auger, he drilled pilot holes into the cabin logs at 3-foot intervals, running from ground level to the eave line. He drove the poles into these holes, leaving them projecting perpendicular to the wall. Each pole was secured with a wooden wedge driven alongside it in the pilot hole. The result was a series of stub projections that would support the ice wall. The first course of ice blocks went down on January 27th. Torstein lifted each 45-pound block, positioned it on the foundation platform, and pushed it carefully against the spacer poles. The blocks did not fit perfectly, but ice's slight tackiness caused blocks to adhere to each other when pressed together. Between blocks, he inserted his bark-covered wooden dividers, creating vertical separations every 18 inches along the wall length. The work was brutally cold. His hands cramped inside fur-lined gloves. His breath froze on his beard. He could work for roughly 40 minutes before retreating inside to warm himself by the fire, then returned to place more blocks. Each course required approximately 20 blocks, and he managed 3 courses per day during the short hours of useful daylight. By February 2nd, the wall stood 4 feet high. By February 9th, it reached 6 feet. The air gap remained consistent, maintained by the spacer poles at regular intervals. Torstein could slip his hand into the gap from above and feel the temperature difference. The trapped air was noticeably warmer than the exterior air, already beginning to function as insulation. The final courses went up during the 2nd week of February. The wall reached the cabin's eave line at 7.5 feet, creating a continuous ice barrier along the entire north wall. Torstein sealed the top by laying flat pieces of split wood across the gap, preventing snow or rain from falling into the airspace. The construction had taken 19 days of sustained work in extreme cold. He stepped back and examined what he had built. The ice wall looked strange, almost alien against the traditional log cabin. Other trappers would certainly mock it, but the thermometer inside his cabin was already showing changes. The interior temperature had climbed to 28 degrees. The airspace between ice wall and cabin wall was where the physics of Torstein's design either succeeded or failed. He could not see into the gap except from above, but he understood what needed to happen inside that 8-inch void. The trapped air needed to remain still, creating a thermal barrier that prevented cold from the ice reaching the cabin logs. If convection currents formed, moving cold air, Downward and warm air upward in continuous circulation, the insulation effect would be compromised. Torstein monitored the system carefully during its first week of operation. He placed his hand against the interior cabin wall at different heights, feeling for temperature variations that would indicate air movement in the gap. The wall felt uniformly cool, but not cold. More importantly, the temperature remained consistent, from floor level to ceiling level, suggesting minimal convection. The air in the gap was staying relatively still. The wooden spacer poles served a purpose beyond structural support. By breaking the gap into sections approximately 3 feet wide, the poles disrupted any large-scale air circulation patterns. Cold air sinking in one section could not easily flow into adjacent sections. The vertical bark dividers between ice blocks created additional compartmentalization, further limiting air movement. The result was not a single 8-inch air gap, but dozens of smaller isolated air pockets that remained largely static. Temperature measurements confirmed the system was working. With the same fire he had maintained all winter, consuming roughly the same amount of wood per day, the interior cabin temperature climbed from 15 degrees to 30 degrees. The 15-degree improvement was dramatic and immediate. Torstein no longer saw his breath inside the cabin. Water in a bucket near the wall no longer froze solid overnight. His sleeping furs felt warm instead of merely less cold. The ice wall itself showed interesting behavior. The outer surface, exposed to wind and ambient air, remained at exterior temperature, but the inner surface, facing the air gap, was noticeably warmer. Torstein could feel the difference when he reached down from above to touch both surfaces. The inner ice surface was perhaps 10 degrees warmer than the outer surface, indicating that heat from the cabin was radiating across the air gap and warming the ice slightly. This warming concerned him initially. If the ice melted, the wall would collapse. But the warming was minimal, and the exterior temperatures were well below freezing. The ice remained solid, and the slight temperature increase actually benefited the system. Warmer ice on the inner surface meant less extreme temperature differential across the air gap, which reduced the driving force for heat loss. The vertical channels created by wooden dividers between ice blocks served an unexpected function. As interior moisture occasionally reached the air gap through small gaps in the cabin logs, it condensed on the ice surface and ran downward through these channels, draining out at the foundation level rather than pooling in the gap. The design was accidentally managing moisture without Torstein having planned for it. By late February, the triple-wall system was functioning exactly as Torstein had hoped. The cabin felt fundamentally different, transformed from barely survivable shelter to genuinely comfortable space. His firewood consumption had dropped noticeably. He was burning roughly 60% of what he had used previously. The true test came during the first week of March, when a high-pressure system settled over Wyoming territory and temperatures plummeted to levels that killed men even in well-prepared camps. On March 4th, Torstein's exterior thermometer read -5 degrees at dawn. By noon, it had climbed only to -3. Wind was minimal, but the cold was absolute and penetrating. Inside his cabin, the thermometer read 42 degrees. Torstein sat at his small table, wearing a single wool shirt, writing in his journal by light from the window. His fire burned at moderate intensity, consuming wood at a rate he could sustain indefinitely with his stockpiled supply. The contrast between interior comfort and exterior lethality was so stark it seemed impossible. He did the calculation multiple times to ensure accuracy. Exterior temperature, -3 degrees, interior temperature, 42 degrees, difference, 45 degrees. His triple-wall ice system was creating a 45-degree thermal barrier. The numbers were undeniable and revolutionary. Other trappers in the region were suffering. Torstein heard reports through occasional visitors who traveled between camps. Men were burning through wood supplies at desperate rates, staying alive but barely. Several trappers had abandoned their cabins entirely, moving to lower elevations or seeking shelter in larger settlements. The winter was claiming lives weekly, and those who survived were exhausted from the constant battle against cold. Torstein's firewood consumption had stabilized at approximately 40% of his previous rate. The insulated cabin required less heat input to maintain comfortable temperature, and it held that heat for extended periods. He could let his fire burn down to coals overnight and wake to a cabin still at 35 degrees. Previously, the same fire reduction would have resulted in interior temperatures dropping to 10 degrees or below. The ice wall showed no signs of failure. The blocks remained solidly stacked, adhering to each other and to the foundation platform. Some settling had occurred, perhaps 2 inches over the wall's total height, but the spacer poles accommodated this movement without compromising the air gap. The wooden dividers between blocks kept everything aligned vertically. On March 8th, a trapper named Jacob Heilmann appeared at Torstein's door. Heilmann was a German immigrant who had trapped the region for 6 years. He looked haggard, frost covering his beard and eyebrows, his hands shaking from cold even inside heavy mittens. Torstein brought him inside immediately. Heilmann stood just inside the door, confused. He pulled off his mittens and held his hands out, feeling the warm air. He looked at Torstein, then at the fireplace, then around the cabin interior. His confusion was visible. The cabin should not be this warm. No frontier cabin could be this warm in -3-degree weather with a moderate fire. Torstein handed him coffee and waited. Heilmann drank, warming gradually, and finally asked the question, "How?" Torstein walked him to the door, opened it, and pointed at the ice wall. Heilmann stepped outside, examined the construction, walked along its length, touched the ice blocks, peered down into the gap from above. He came back inside and asked Torstein to explain everything. The lesson began. Jacob Heilmann stayed at Torstein's cabin for 2 hours, learning the principles behind the triple wall system. He took measurements with a length of marked cord, sketched diagrams on birch bark, and asked detailed questions about spacer placement, air gap width, and ice block dimensions. When he left, he carried the knowledge but also skepticism. The system worked in Torstein's cabin, but Heilmann wondered if he could replicate it. 3 weeks later, on March 29th, a spring blizzard struck the territory with unexpected violence. Spring storms were common, but this one brought winter conditions back in full force. Heavy snow fell for 2 days straight, driven by winds that gusted to what Torstein estimated was 40 miles per hour. Temperature dropped to -10 degrees, colder than any March weather he had experienced in 8 years. Torstein's cabin handled the storm easily. The ice wall blocked wind completely on the north side where the worst gusts hit. Interior temperature remained at 40 degrees throughout the storm. He burned wood at his normal rate, comfortable and safe, while the blizzard raged outside. Jacob Heilmann's cabin had no ice wall. He had intended to build one, but had not yet started when the storm arrived. His cabin was traditional construction, adequate for normal winter, but not designed for extreme conditions. On the second day of the storm, as wind penetrated every gap in his chinking and cold overwhelmed his ability to generate heat fast enough, Heilmann made a survival decision. He abandoned his cabin. The journey to Torstein's location was 3 miles through blizzard conditions. Heilmann wrapped himself in every fur he owned, filled his pockets with dried meat, and left his cabin mid-afternoon. He followed the creek drainage, using landmarks he knew from summer travel. Visibility was perhaps 20 feet. Temperature, with wind chill, was lethal within minutes of exposure. He arrived at Torstein's cabin after dark, hypothermic and near collapse. Torstein heard him pounding on the door and pulled him inside immediately. Heilmann could barely speak. His clothing was frozen stiff. Ice covered his face. Torstein stripped the frozen furs off him, wrapped him in dry blankets, and positioned him near the fireplace. It took 3 hours before Heilmann stopped shaking. By the next morning, Heilmann had recovered enough to talk. He described his cabin becoming uninhabitable, fire unable to keep up with heat loss, interior temperature dropping despite burning wood as fast as he could feed it. He had recognized that staying meant freezing and chose to risk the journey instead. The decision had nearly killed him, but the alternative was certain death. Heilmann spent 4 days at Torstein's cabin while the storm cleared and temperatures moderated. During that time, he studied every detail of the ice wall construction. He measured the air gap repeatedly. He examined how spacers were attached. He looked at the foundation platform and the sealing method at the top. He took notes on everything. When he finally returned to his own cabin, he carried plans to build his own ice wall before the next winter. The technique had saved his life, and he would not face another season without it. Spring arrived in mid-April, and the trapping community began its annual accounting of who had survived the winter. 17 men had died between November and March across Wyoming and Montana territories. Most had frozen in their cabins despite having adequate firewood and knowledge of fire management. The cabins themselves had failed, unable to protect their occupants against sustained extreme cold. Jacob Heilmann told his story to every trapper he encountered. He described Torstein's ice wall in detail, explained the triple-layer principle, and emphasized the 40-degree temperature difference he had personally experienced. Some trappers dismissed the idea as too labor-intensive or too strange. Others listened carefully and asked questions. By May, 5 trappers had approached Torstein directly, asking him to help them understand the construction method. He shared his knowledge freely, walking them through the engineering principles, the importance of the air gap, the function of spacers and dividers. He explained that the ice wall needed to be on the side of the cabin facing prevailing winter winds, usually north or northwest in their region. He showed them how to cut uniform blocks and how to build the foundation platform. Summer preparations began in June. Ice would not be available until late autumn, but the process of stockpiling ice required planning. Several trappers built ice houses, structures designed to store ice through summer months using thick layers of sawdust as insulation. They cut ice from high-elevation lakes, where ice lingered into June, packed it in sawdust, and stored it in shaded locations. The effort was substantial, but the alternative was waiting until winter to begin construction. Torstein helped 3 trappers build ice walls during the autumn of 1843, before the first heavy snows arrived. Each construction took approximately 3 weeks with 2 men working together. The technique was spreading, adapted slightly by each builder, but maintaining the core principle: ice wall, air gap, cabin wall. Winter 1843 to 1844 was milder than the previous year, but still harsh by any reasonable standard. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees in January. Heavy snows buried cabins to their eaves. Wind drove through the valleys with sustained force. Men with ice-walled cabins survived comfortably, burning moderate amounts of firewood and maintaining interior temperatures in the mid-30s to low 40s. Men without ice walls struggled, some abandoning their cabins temporarily during the worst cold snaps. By spring 1844, 12 cabins in the region featured ice wall construction. Not a single trapper using the technique had suffered serious cold-related problems during the winter tseres. Meanwhile, traditional cabins continued to fail. 2 more men froze to death, both in standard construction shelters that could not maintain adequate interior temperature. The technique acquired a name within the trapping community: Bjørnstad's ice fortress method. Trappers used the term with respect rather than mockery now. Men who had initially laughed at Torstein's construction were asking for his help. The innovation had proven itself through the most rigorous testing possible: 2 consecutive winters in conditions that killed men regularly. Torstein continued trapping through 1845, but the fur trade was declining. Beaver populations had crashed from over-trapping, and eastern markets were shifting away from fur felt. the ice wall technique had limitations that became clear as more trappers attempted to replicate Torstein's success. The method required a water source close enough to make ice harvesting practical. Creeks or ponds needed to freeze thick enough to yield blocks of adequate size, which meant elevations above 6,000 feet in the Rocky Mountain region. The construction was labor-intensive, demanding weeks of brutal work in cold conditions. And the technique only functioned in climates with sustained freezing temperatures. Where temperatures fluctuated above freezing regularly, ice walls would melt and fail. But within those limitations, the method was remarkably effective. Trappers in Montana Territory adopted variations through the late 1840s. Homesteaders who arrived in the 1850s, settling valleys in Wyoming and Dakota Territory, heard stories of ice-walled cabins and built their own versions. Some used the technique seasonally, constructing ice walls in late autumn and allowing them to melt away in spring. Others built permanent double-wall cabins with air gaps, using the same principle Torstein had discovered, but substituting wood for ice. The scientific principle underlying Torstein's innovation would later be recognized formally. Multi-wall construction with air gaps provided superior insulation compared to single-wall structures. By the 1870s, architects in eastern cities were designing buildings with cavity walls specifically to trap dead air for thermal insulation. They did not know about a Norwegian trapper's ice walls in Wyoming, but they were applying the same physics. Torstein left the mountains in 1851 at age 44. The fur trade had collapsed completely. Beaver were scarce, and silk had replaced fur felt in hat manufacturing. Men who had lived as trappers for decades were finding new occupations or moving to agricultural regions. Torstein traveled to Minnesota Territory, purchased land near a small settlement that would later become Duluth, and began building homes for incoming settlers. He applied his knowledge of thermal design to every structure he built. He constructed double-wall cabins with air gaps for families who could afford the extra labor. He explained heat loss principles to anyone who would listen. He never became wealthy or famous, but he earned respect as a builder who understood how to make homes comfortable in harsh climates. Torstein married in 1853. His wife Ingrid was a Norwegian immigrant 15 years younger, who had arrived in Minnesota with her family the previous year. They had 4 children between 1854 and 1862. He lived a quiet life, building homes, clearing land, and raising his family far from the wilderness that had nearly killed him. He died in December 1869 at age 62 from pneumonia that progressed too quickly for treatment. He was buried in a cemetery outside the settlement, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross. His children remembered him as a carpenter and farmer. They knew he had trapped in the mountains before settling in Minnesota, but the details of his innovation were not preserved in family stories. In the mountains of Wyoming and Montana, abandoned cabins with ice-stained walls stood as silent testament to a technique that had saved dozens of lives, proving that understanding heat transfer mattered more than simply building bigger fires.